Could we all be seated, please? Thank you for taking your seats, and good morning. Good morning, and welcome to CRWUA 2017. What a great all-volunteer organization this is. CRWUA brings us together every year and provides us an opportunity to see old friends and to make new ones. This is a time for us to celebrate our accomplishments together and to reflect on the challenges that still lie ahead. Whether we come from farming backgrounds in the ag areas of the lower basin like I do, or from municipal water districts in the upper basin, or really anywhere in between, we can use this conference as an opportunity to share ideas, to work through challenges, and to pat each other on the back for jobs well done. We live in interesting and turbulent times, and we have an opportunity at this conference to learn from each other, break through areas of conflict, or simply to take a break and to be thankful for what we have achieved together. I appreciate the 2 years that I have served as president of CRWUA, and California looks forward to passing the baton over to Colorado for their leadership turn next year. Thank you to the CRWUA trustees, to all of our committees, and of course, to all of you who attend our conference for helping to make this conference such an outstanding annual event. One of our most recent successes has been the Senate's confirmation of our own Brenda Berman as the first female commissioner ever of the Bureau of Reclamation. Brenda has been our dear friend and associate, either as a native Californian or an exported Arizonan, and I know she will do well in protecting all of our interests in the Colorado River Basin. Many congratulations to Brenda and to the rest of the team at Interior for bringing her on board. This year's conference theme focuses on how we bring various musical instruments together to play in one orchestra. And an example of that has been the successful collaboration with Mexico in completing Minute 323 during September of this year. Minute 323 developed out of the successful path we charted under Minute 319, our pilot minute, which also followed other successful minutes, themselves examples of binational cooperation. Minute 323 builds on the past and provides a roadmap to our future with opportunities for binational projects and expanded areas of cooperation on issues such as salinity control. Minute 323 includes a very important binational water scarcity plan, and I applaud our Mexican neighbors and colleagues for their leadership and their foresight in working with us to get that completed. Minute 323's water scarcity provisions will kick in if, and hopefully when, we come together on our own drought contingency plans in the United States. We will hear presentations on Friday about Minute 323, and as always, we very much welcome the participation of our Mexican friends and colleagues at this conference. We look forward to continuing to celebrate Minute 323 during our entire conference. Although we have continued to make progress on our own lower basin drought contingency planning, we have been at the same level, basic level of agreement now for years, and we must push forward to finalize that agreement. Even though we had a few decent snow years in the upper basin, we've seen below average rainfall and snowfall in the basin so far this year, and we certainly don't know how this year or subsequent years will turn out in terms of runoff. Although we have successfully avoided a shortage in the lower basin so far, we must develop plans for further conservation in the event we see very dry years ahead. We're off to a good start with our conservation efforts, especially in the lower basin. And as John Fleck often points out, we're using less water today than we did 20 years ago, despite increased population and increased economic activity. The lesson learned is that continued conservation efforts and maximizing flexibility in our water management programs will be essential to successful drought operations. As we saw in California, we had record-breaking years of drought, followed by record-breaking high levels of precipitation last winter. Storage in Lake Mead helped to buffer the effects of the California drought, and now Lake Mead storage levels will benefit from conservation volumes, significant ones, that are available this year because of increased supplies within California. We must ensure that the incentive for conservation and for storage always exists, especially at lower elevation levels in our reservoirs. We know that the upper basin states have been taking drought contingency planning seriously as well. I commend the work of the Upper Colorado River Commission on the tough job they have of working through issues among 4 different basin states. And I appreciate the cooperation of those upper basin states as we collectively work to improve water management throughout the basin. One example of successful coordination has been the System Conservation Program. This has become a popular tool in the upper basin to encourage conservation. One extraordinary feature of it is the ensuing discussion of what former Secretary of Interior Salazar calls a necessary social compact that encourages a robust and productive agricultural economy and that of the rural communities that exist to support agriculture. As municipalities and others look to agricultural fallowing and water transfers to fill shortfalls, this critically important discussion emphasizes rural agriculture's alternatives to what we call buy and dry. We will hear updates today about the progress and the challenges of that program from participants in both basins. The 10 Tribes Partnership is always an important partner in this conference. They should be complimented for their patience and their perseverance in moving forward to complete the tribal water study. The 10 Tribes Partnership and the Bureau of Reclamation have been working diligently on this study for the past 4 years with the goal to develop tribal-specific water management strategies that build off the original basin study that was completed in 2012. Although the final draft of the tribal water study is still under review, our program this afternoon includes a panel highlighting elements of the study and will feature tribal leaders from throughout the basin. The Colorado River Basin tribes are important members of our community, and they will continue to be important partners in our conservation programs. We look forward to hearing more details during the Tribal Water Study panel and during remarks by our federal officials on Friday. And last but not least, I want to thank the NGO, non-government organization community for their continued assistance with our conference and for their contributions to many ongoing programs throughout the basin, such as the Endangered Species Recovery Programs and the binational habitat restoration programs. We have a history of collaboration in our basin that includes addressing environmental challenges, and the programs we have developed together have not only helped to protect our ongoing water uses, but have also protected our endangered species and our critical natural habitat areas. The CRWUA trustees appreciates the financial contributions to this conference from the Walton Family Foundation, and we're looking forward to a presentation at lunch from the foundation about the programs they currently support. After my president's comments, we will view the annual video that will be quite different this year. Many of you might recall during the 10 Tribes presidency, where leaders of the tribes commented directly to us using their video. From California, we want to do something similar with a very short video featuring vignettes with policymakers from California. And hopefully this will become a tradition among the states and the 10 Tribes Partnership for the future to help each of us tell our stories. Every year, the conference program is influenced by the issues and the initiatives of the sitting CRWUA president and his home state. That is one reason why the presidency rotates amongst the Basin states and the 10 Tribes Partnership. And this has helped to provide balance to our association over the last 70 years. I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to highlight the California perspective these last 2 years, and I'm looking forward to hearing the Colorado perspective next year. After the video, our first plenary panel will convene to once again discuss drought contingency planning in both basins. This panel is moderated by Eric Kuhn, recently retired manager of the Colorado River District, and himself a living encyclopedia of the Upper Colorado River Basin. We will miss Eric as manager of the district, but we welcome him as moderator of this panel. Last year, we heard that we were close to a lower basin drought agreement. It'll be interesting to hear what happened, and also to hear from the upper basin regarding their plan. The second plenary panel will be a great sequel to the first, as it will discuss present-day Colorado River conservation projects. Think of this panel, moderated by Taylor Hawes, as describing what is happening with river conservation in lieu of no drought contingency plans. And a lot is happening. Our luncheon will follow, and it'll allow us to hear directly, as I said earlier, from the Walton Foundation about their interest in the river and in our association. Then in the afternoon, we have opportunities to select between concurrent sessions. This format has proved popular with attendees in the past. During session 1 at 1:15, Janine Jones of California will lead a discussion regarding the Farm Bill reauthorization. And the concurrent panel at that time will be moderated by the entertaining Jim Dunlap from the San Juan Water Commission of New Mexico regarding water supplies during natural disasters. Our last two concurrent sessions for the day will be finding new uses for existing infrastructure, moderated by Arizonan Alexandra Arboleda at 2:30. And concurrent to that session, we will discuss findings, as I mentioned earlier, from the not yet completed tribal water study, moderated by Darrell Vigil of the Jicarilla Apache Nation. After a session break, we will convene the traditional percolation and runoff reception in the exhibit hall, where we all have the opportunity for fellowship and for, importantly, visiting with each of our exhibitors. Tomorrow, after a short business meeting, we have the opportunity to celebrate Minute 323 along with Mexico's CONAGUA, that is Comisión Nacional del Agua, National Water Commissioner Victor Alcocer, CILA, Comisión Nacional de Límites y Agua, Director General Dr. Roberto Salmón, and U.S. International and Boundary Water Commissioner Edward Dracena. We will also celebrate the centennial anniversary of the Salt River Project with the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. Following those celebrations, We will hear from the federal leadership team at Interior and Reclamation, and I'm happy to announce that at least one of those speakers will be our own Brenda Berman. It will be great to hear Brenda for the first time in her new capacity. As I previously mentioned, it has been a distinct honor to serve as CRWUA president these past 2 years. I sincerely appreciate the support and assistance I have received from other trustees, and I wish the very best to our friends from Colorado as they assume the leadership role for our association. Thanks again to our diligent volunteer committees and their respective volunteer leadership, and to Southern Nevada Water Authority for the expert administrative staffing support they provide that pulls everything together to allow us to produce this great conference. Most of all, thanks to you for attending our conference, and I hope each of us has a great time. Now, on to the video, and thank you. For California, and especially for Southern California, Colorado River water is essential to life.
You know, it is the lifeblood of Metropolitan. It's the reason Metropolitan came into existence, was to build the Colorado River Aqueduct during the Great Depression. And so when I think of the Colorado River, I really think of it as, Metropolitan's story.
That where the Colorado River is concerned, we really are in this together.
Starting around 2000, as we entered into drought, we've seen a remarkable amount of success collaborating amongst Arizona, Nevada, and California as we've really tried to work together both intra-California and among the Basin states.
The partnerships that Coachella Valley Water District has with other agencies in Southern California have really been important for managing Colorado River water resources. We have an excellent relationship with San Diego County Water Authority, where they've been funding the lining of a portion of the Coachella Canal. We also work with Metropolitan Water District, and we're able to take extra water. So in a wet year such as this, we're able to put that water in a place and store it for later use. And that's been really great for both agencies.
We've had water transfers both with the Coachella Valley Irrigation District as well as Metropolitan Water District.
I think there's a history of collaborating among the water users on the Colorado River.
We're all connected on the river. What happens in the upper basin affects us in the lower basin. What happens in the lower basin affects the upper basin. What happens in both basins affects Mexico. And there's no reason not to have Mexico at the table as a partner. 323, I think, represents a wonderful step forward that can benefit both nations significantly.
Water transfers are threatened by this open question of what becomes of the Salton Sea. So it's in everybody's interest to take it on now, to finally understand that it's not the kind of problem you can defer into the future anymore.
There are a lot of issues that are all related to water supply at the Salton Sea that need to be mitigated and need to be identified. And I know there's progress on both fronts, but it hasn't come together yet.
Another issue has been California Water Fix, which is something of a delta bypass that really would help strengthen the reliability of the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project up in the Sacramento Bay Area. So in that sense, I think of all the basin states are very interconnected here in ensuring that we make progress on the Salton Sea and that we see a successful, viable California Water Fix project moving forward.
Those personal relationships in state and out of state drive collaboration along the river that has been the keynote to our success in dealing
with shorter supplies, both from the river and the State Water Project in California.
So we at Coachella Valley Water District, as other agencies do, believe that working together is the best way to go forward, and we've been all demonstrating that, in particular in the drought contingency planning process, to find solutions.
Metropolitan's going to leave nearly 400,000 acre-feet of intentionally created surplus in Lake Mead. That's going to help bolster the lake.
Because of the issues that we have are not isolated to one irrigation district or one municipality.
And I believe that working together really is the best path forward for us in managing this resource.
Then I think a better course is to sit down with the other parties and figure out how to make that river work for everybody now and in the future.
Well, good morning. If I could have our all-star panel up here. And I tell you, if a presentation that included a ballet by John Ensminger and Jeff Keitlinger won't get a crowd, what will? Yeah. As the panelists come up, let me just give you a real quick introduction. As we heard from President Fisher, we've been sort of in the red zone when it comes to the drought contingency plans for a while. And one of the challenges that I'd like to hear from this panel is going to be, how do we get across the line? How do we finish these? The other couple questions that I want them to address are, we've really got some complicated issues, a number of them, not just the drought contingency plan, but we're beginning the process of renegotiating what I will call a next generation of the interim guidelines, the 2007 interim guidelines, critical to the future of this basin. We have new projects in the pipeline. We have probably federal legislation. So how do we choreograph that? How do we coordinate that? And with that, let me also introduce the panelists in the order that they're going to speak. You've got their biographies, so what I wanted to do is just tell you a little bit about their predecessors. First, we're going to have Kevin Kelly from the Imperial Irrigation District. And of course, 100 years ago, it was Kevin's predecessors that got this ball rolling. 100 years ago, we had the All-American Canal Board. The All-American Canal Board led to the Kincaid Act, which led to the Fall-Davis Report. And that Fall-Davis report recommended a couple of things. One was the comprehensive development of the river, including the Boulder Canyon Project Act. Interestingly, it was referred to, the report was referred to the problems of the Imperial Valley and its vicinity. So we have the Imperial Valley, and the other four are the vicinity. Next, we have John Ensminger from Nevada. The Fall-Davis report was really helpful to those folks in Carson City. They now understood that Nevada was a Colorado River state. It was very helpful. The other thing, a few years later, they also came to a really important conclusion. That conclusion was these other 6 states were fools. They offered Nevada 300,000 acre-feet. Didn't they really know that that was about 100 times what Nevada really needed? Next, we'll go to Don Osler in the Upper Basin. Of course, in the Upper Basin, we're the purists when it comes to the appropriation doctrine, the Colorado doctrine, as Greg Hobbs would say. Now, the problem was we finally thought, wait a minute, there's be some big projects in the Lower Basin with some very senior rights, first in time, first in right. We're in trouble. We need a compact. So the Fall-Davis report spooked the Upper Basin, and that led to our insistence on a compact. Next, we'll have Tom Bushofsky from Arizona. And what can I say? When you look at the minutes of the 1922 compact, the first meeting, about 10 minutes into that meeting, the other 6 states and Chairman Hoover had came to a conclusion that sort of guides us on Arizona for the rest of the remaining 95 years. That is, when it comes to the Colorado River, Arizona is going to be a real pain in the ass. And finally, we have Jeff Keitlinger. Jeff is from Metropolitan, and as he said in his opening remarks on the video, you know, the folks in Metropolitan, they were ready to build something, and they got it. Not only did they do the aqueduct, but they stepped up when the secretary needed someone to sign the contracts for water and power that would guarantee the repayment of Boulder Canyon, of Hoover Dam. And that's what they did. They signed those contracts, they guaranteed the repayment, and the rest is history. Now they forgot one minor detail, and that detail was, in the long run, really, is there enough water here for us? And Jeff will tell us a little bit about that detail when it's his turn. So with that, let me introduce Kevin, and I figure you can either go to the podium or you can speak from the, in front of you from the, if you so choose.
I'm going to stand up just because the title suggests that we're all going to be called on to dance. And, you know, this is just a wild guess, but I'm thinking that ballet doesn't immediately spring to mind when you look at this group of what I want to talk about, it's really to reprise what I spoke about last year, or at least to update the record. I talked about our problem in the Imperial Valley, the impediment to IID's participation in a drought contingency plan, which is the Salton Sea, and we've had something of a breakthrough there. I believe our own state board just last month adopted a stipulated order for a 10-year plan. And we expect to go back to our own administration now and talk about how we participate in the DCP. So I've said before, and I think it's incontrovertible, that no single agency has a greater interest in the continued viability of this watershed at the Colorado River. And no single agency can have a greater impact on elevation at Lake Mead than can IID. So I do want to acknowledge IID has 3 board members here today. Directors Norma Galindo, Eric Ortega, and our newest director, Juanita Salas. If you see them during the course of the day, please tell them how highly you regard me. So, you know, I could show you a video or you know, 10 or 12 slides. I've never known it to be true that a speaker is penalized for coming under his allotted time. And so all I want to leave you with is the notion that every agency, every state acts in its own interests. And we know that. Everyone knows that. What I've been struck by in working with these gentlemen these last, I think it's 3 years now. Feels like 3 decades, but is that everyone does, in fact, act in their own interests, but there is this you know, sort of tacit understanding that we're with the Colorado River and with climate and with the challenges that we all face. We need to do something for this river that we all rely on. And there was some urgency attached to it a couple of years. I think it'll be a real test now among the states, with the federal government, and with our own state in California, to determine if we really want to act, take some risk, and actually, make a difference in that river that we can't do without. So, Bart Fisher, I want to thank you for putting California first these last couple of years, and for all your help too. So I'll look forward to your questions. Thanks very much.
So, most of you know me. I'm the kind of guy that dances on the inside, so I'm going to stay seated. This is my 19th consecutive CRWUA, and I can say without reservation, having sat at the table for the surplus guideline negotiations, the QSA, the 07 guidelines, minutes 316 through 323, this is not a ballet. It is by turns a mosh pit, and at times an extremely awkward 7th grade dance at the gym where no one will come off of the wall and engage in a meaningful fashion. But it is not, and never has been, and never will be, in my opinion, a ballet. Mosh pit. Thank you, James Eklund. All that being said, we work pretty well together. If you look around the country, if you look around the world, our basin continues to be a model for how to achieve things through cooperation and collaboration. You show me another basin that's had its agreements translated into Russian, translated into Spanish, and I'll be surprised because what we do transcends our basin. It goes to other parts of the world. So I guess the major question is, are we up to the challenge moving forward? We sat here with almost the exact same panel, I think, last year, seemingly on the precipice of success. And in the last 12 months, I have sat on, at a minimum, I haven't actually gone through and counted my calendar, but at least 8 panels I've sat on discussing DCP and how close we are to achieving this monumental next step on the river. And I think I've sat on maybe 5 actual negotiating meetings in the last 12 months trying to achieve it. So we're doing a lot of talking, but we're not doing a whole lot of moving. That being said, I believe we're close. I do not believe that the challenges in front of us are insurmountable. I believe that DCP is foundational to the success and ultimately, frankly, not the survival. I don't want to be melodramatic and say it's the survival of the basin, but it's the survival of how we do business. Are we going to cooperate? Are we going to pre-negotiate how we share in shortages and in the effects of climate change? Or are we going to devolve into squabbling and litigation and adversarial relationships? That's what I think is at stake with DCP. So I hope, and this is going to torture the pun considerably, I hope that Nevada, who is ready to sign DCP today, can find dance partners to get DCP across the finish line. And with that, I will execute a tortured plie and hand the mic over to Mr. Osler.
Thank you, John. I also agree that we have not yet started the ballet. One of the big obstacles was finding a pair of leotards that would fit John. And then getting him to wear them. I guess I would term what we've been doing so far has been a rather slow dance. No one is getting too close in spite of there being no chaperones. We're occasionally stepping on one another's toes. No one has completely fallen down or stopped dancing. I think maybe in the upper basin we are getting a little bit anxious. We're more ready for rock and roll to get things going if we can. We're anxious to see drought contingency plans put forward in the lower basin and the upper basin. We know that we, as a basin, bootstrapped ourselves together long ago, and it's a good thing, with interim guidelines and other various agreements that, as Bart indicated, what happens in the lower basin affects the upper basin, and what happens in the upper basin affects the lower basin, and we all affect Mexico. And I think we, as a basin, have finally learned that it's a lot better to work together. It's better if we all learn the steps and dance together. We have less casualties. So with that, let me just mention a little bit about the upper basin. There's a great deal of discussion about the lower basin DCP, and rightly so. And there's been a great deal of discussion about the Mexican Minute 323, which contains provisions for additional drought conserving measures or scarcity plans. But in the upper basin, we also have concerns and the need to establish a drought contingency plan. And you've heard before at this conference that it consists of three basic components. One is weather modification or cloud seeding, and that's off and running and being strengthened greatly with partnerships in the lower basin. We think it's probably the cheapest water that we can acquire. It's not an ultimate solution, but it's certainly one that is worth pursuing, and it's an economical one, and we hope to see that expanded, and we appreciate very much the assistance from the lower basin and their participation in that. We also have a component of our drought contingency plan, which is demand management, which is conservation, more like the lower basin ICS plans. But it's a very different problem in the upper basin than it is in the lower basin, and we have a lot of issues that we need to figure out to be able to decide whether that will work for us, like it is such a useful tool in the lower basin. But in reality, when we're successful with demand management or any of our drought operations, what it does is puts water in Lake Powell, which happens to be below where anybody in the upper basin can use it at the present time. The use of that is for hydropower production and to ensure our compliance with the compact. We can't get that water back if it turns out to be not needed or if there's conditions change in the future. So it's a different problem, and we have issues of being able to get the water that is conserved on site to individual farming or to Lake Powell, because we have other water users that have rights to withdraw water between the path of that conservation and Lake Powell. Our major tool from our upper basin drought contingency plan is what we call drought operations, but it involves water that happens to be stored higher in upper basin reservoirs, selected CRSP reservoirs, primarily Flaming Gorge, the Aspinall Unit, Navajo. When that water is available and when we hit extremely low reservoir elevations in Lake Powell, would allow for the transfer of that water to Lake Powell by increased releases, all in accordance with the existing rods that govern the operation of those facilities. But potentially there's a fairly large volume of water that can be transferred in that way in order to avoid critical low elevations at Lake Powell. These are low probability occurrences for the upper basin, but they're very high consequence if we don't have a plan to address it. And we know that we have to work with the lower basin on our plan. We have coordinated reservoir operations, and so the way that Lake Powell is operated very much affects Lake Mead and vice versa. And we're open and opening a dialogue with the Lower Basin representatives to understand better our process for determining these actions, and will continue to do so, as they have done to us with their Lower Basin Drought Contingency Plan. So I think the other thing that is staring us in the face, and we have to continue to recognize that in the back of our mind, in addition to drought contingency planning, is the rapidly approaching time when we need to coordinate or consult on review of the interim guidelines and the extension of those guidelines. These drought contingency plans and those actions will be important in those decisions, but they are not going to be sufficient to solve all of the problems and address the future. We think they're a good first step, particularly in the Lower Basin. We think that probably additional tough decisions will need to be made in the future because of the continued projection for relatively low water elevations in Lake Mead and lower elevations in Lake Powell than we'd like to see. So I think I'll leave my remarks at that. Those are big issues that face us. I think we are rapidly approaching the time in the Upper Basin where we can all agree and begin to implement these provisions. And we hope that in the Lower Basin that also is hastened. Thank you.
So I'll start out by saying 2 directors ago, Sandy Favorites, who asked me to come to work at DWR to work on Colorado River issues, among other things, always called me a curmudgeon. So I guess I'm the perfect person to be that Arizona pain in the ass that Eric talked about. I will say, though, that the drought contingency plan is extremely important to the state of Arizona. John's got his straw down to Deadpool in Lake Mead, so the elevations are not that important to him. He can still serve, but we're not in that situation in Arizona. California has largely the senior priority. Hopefully things will never get bad enough to hit the senior priority users in California or in Arizona. So it really falls mostly on Arizona, and we're the ones most at risk, and we absolutely need the drought contingency plan. We're continuing to try to work towards that end. We have real challenges within the state of Arizona because of how the drought contingency plan impacts different water use sectors, but also water right holders within each of those sectors also get impacted differently, each one differently. So it creates a real difficult situation to kind of herd those cats and get their support for the drought contingency plan. And I've probably said this on every panel that I've been, next to John and Jeff and others, but I have to go to the Arizona State Legislature to get approval to sign off on the drought contingency plan. That's not going to happen without very strong support within the state from maybe not unanimous, but perhaps close to unanimous number of folks and water users. So that is one of our challenges, and John used my mosh pit line already, but that's where I think we are in Arizona right now in our internal discussions, mosh pit. And I think this past year and the good hydrology we had and the success that we have all collectively created in conserving water in Lake Mead among the states and with Mexico having 18 feet or so of water in that lake, offsetting shortages the last few years, has in a way hurt us. Because I think folks in Arizona, many of them think that we can solve our problems through just that mechanism. And I think we know from looking at various hydrologic scenarios that that's not the case. But we'll continue to work hard as we can to try to get that done so we can sign off on the DCP. I've actually seen over the last few months in discussions about potentially partially mitigating the impacts of the DCP, people asking for more than they were asking for 6 months or 8 months ago. So our challenge is growing, not contracting. In the bigger scheme of things, I absolutely agree with Don Osler. When we get into the discussions of the end of the 2007 guidelines and look to see what we're going to put forward from that point on, we do need to go far beyond what's in the guidelines and probably far beyond what's in the DCP. And in 2013, when the Basin State Principals came together to embark on what now has become DCP, the charge to us from those principals at that time was to get in a room, all 7 states, and look for things that were considered to be outside the box. That was our original process, the outside the box process, and that there would be no sacred cows. So if the law of the river didn't exist, what would you do? We had some pretty controversial things on that list, kind of things that would be, I think as Jim Locke had coined the term, a grand bargain between the states to better manage the river. That's what we need to do moving forward. The states earlier this fall got together and talked about how we move forward. In 2017, at the beginning of 2017, we committed to use all of our efforts to close on minute 323, which we did. Now we've committed with each other to use all of our efforts to close on DCP, which we're trying to do. When that happens, I think then we turn to the guidelines. We don't need to wait till the 2020 deadline to do that, but we do need to close on DCP before we get there, and I think that's what we've all agreed to do among the principals, concentrate on DCP. When I looked at the theme of this conference and the whole ballet theme, I was trying to figure out how am I going to make a linkage to ballet and what we do in our little negotiation room. But I did find something. I found a passage in a book by Stephen King. The name of the book is The Talisman. And one of the characters is viewing a rehearsal of the ballet and contrasting how different that was from looking at the finished product. And so as he was doing that, the passage that I wanted to read was, and this is how I feel about the discussions with my colleagues in the other basin states. Most of all, he remembered their expressions, all that exhausted concentration, all that pain. But transcending the pain, or at least creeping around its edges, he had seen joy. Joy was unmistakable. And so I think that's my view of how the negotiations go. Painful, but at the end, when we got to that finished product, and there's still some things around the edges we're working on with DCP, I think we all collectively knew that we had put together a really good plan. There was a lot of good give and take on both sides, and it was a great step forward. So with that, I'll end my remarks.
So the problem with going last is every lousy pun and dance joke has now been taken. So I guess I'll skip those. And I had 6 of them. All right. The hard work we put together on this DCP, it actually reminded me of what Eric spoke at the beginning. In 1930s, Metropolitan stepped up to the plate and tried to make all this happen. Metropolitan paid 60-some% of the cost of building Hoover Dam in the middle of the Great Depression, 100% of the cost of building Parker Dam, 100% of the cost of building the Colorado River Aqueduct. They pledged Southern California almost to the tune of 20% of the entire value of the region towards getting these projects done. And then cleverly negotiated the last priority on the Colorado River within California and a whopping 15% of California's water allotment. And I looked at these agreements and I go, how did you negotiate such an incredibly poor deal on behalf of the major funder of the deal? Since then, I've had the privilege of signing things like the QSA, the surplus guidelines, the shortage guidelines, and I know a bunch of young lawyers decades from now will be going, what the was he thinking? You know, how did he negotiate such a ridiculously bad deal on behalf of Metropolitan?
So I have a lot of sympathy and a lot of empathy for those guys in the 1930s that struck our deals, because I know people are going to be looking at this and saying, what were they thinking? So the drought contingency plan we put together is, you know, it's got a lot of meat in it, and it's pretty close. I would say one of the real pleasures has been getting to a working relationship between Metropolitan and IID to where I'd say we are now willing to step up and cover each other and make this happen. I have learned a lot of respect and concern over the Salton Sea, and Kevin has learned a lot about the Bay Delta and the issues of Northern California and knows about the issues that we have. And that, I think, is one of the great pleasures of this. It's probably not an ugly duckling. This is a white swan of a deal. The last couple of years have felt like a real nutcracker, but we have, all right. You had to get one ballet in there. But I do think we have the ability to close this, and we should do it in 2018. There is no reason to drag this out. So, happy to take questions.
Well, thank you, and thanks to this panel for leaving a good time for questions, because I think that's really important that you have the opportunity to actually ask some questions of these superstars we have on this panel. With that, I want to do the first one and just get a couple comments. At the Santa Fe meeting we just had, we heard that there's a probability that we're going to need federal legislation to implement the drought contingency plans. My look at the history of federal legislation in this basin, there's two things. One, it takes time. Even the confirmation of the compact took 7 years. CRSP took 6-7 years. And the second thing is there was always a state that got run over, quite frankly, that said no. In 1929, it was Arizona. In the 50s, it was California. And the others, it was Wyoming, or one of the upper basin states. So my quick question to the panel, then we'll turn it over to the audience for questions, is how do we move legislation forward, even recognizing in an era when Congress actually worked, it was difficult? So I will ask that of Don and anyone on the panel, but Don, John, and the state representatives, Tom and Jeff.
Well, how do we move legislation forward? I think the key to that is that we need all 7 states to be completely in agreement and support. We need all of those senators and Congress people to be in support, and it requires all 7 states. I think we, as water managers, need to get busy and figure out exactly how legislation would work and what specifically is needed in it. We have some outlines and a template. We have not really reached the point where there's complete agreement on what needs to be in it and how that needs to proceed. So the important step is that I think the water managers at the appropriate time, which is getting close, need to focus our attention on what is needed and necessary and required in legislation so that we have 7 state support for what goes forward.
John?
I guess I just echo that. You don't move too many things through Congress these days, but if you're going to move it, we need 14 senators, and it's probably omnibus, cromnibus, continuing resolution. It's not standalone resolution. We just got to wait for the right taxi and hitch a ride.
Tom or
So I agree with that, and I also think that we have to make every effort to keep it as simple as possible and to potentially resist efforts to make it a vehicle for Christmas tree ornaments to be hung, as sometimes happens, because that will probably kill it. So the simpler the better, and with the support of all the 14 senators, people have already said, perhaps we can get that legislation through with minimal pain.
The only thing I would add to that is we need to solve as much of it as we can ourselves. When we go to Congress and ask them to really solve major problems, we usually don't get very far. If we can do 98% of the work ourselves, have it in an agreement that is standing and can stand alone, and we're really just asking for a blessing, that's what we need to do. And most of it's going to require us acting in our own interest and solving our own problems, and then asking for maybe a blessing. Then it becomes a little easier.
Okay, well, thank you. We have quite a bit of time now for questions. Anyone for a question for anyone on the panel? We're going to be way ahead of time if they don't. My goodness. Yes, we do. There we go, sir.
Hi, thank you. Craig Morgan with Avalex from South Lake Tahoe. I have 3 questions. I'd like to get as much input and feedback on it. One, what are the benefits of the DCP to the state of California? 2, what are the benefits of the DCP to the Imperial Irrigation District, who, as I understand, would be responsible for generating much of the water for elevation building? And then 3, who's responsible for mitigating the impacts of the DCP on the Salton Sea?
Okay, those are the 3 questions. I would assume that between Jeff and Kevin, we can handle those.
I'll start, and then Kevin can handle the easy parts about the Salton Sea. Normally, I would ask John to speak for California.
I want to thank my cousin for that softball question.
Yeah. So I look at the benefits for California as twofold. One is when we have stability and peace on the river, that usually works well for California. We are not, and works for all of our interests. So this can't be just because California has a senior water right and we're going to let Arizona and Nevada figure the rest of this out. That does not bode well. We have to solve these issues so that we can have cooperative programs. Among the things we're negotiating and working out is the ability to bank water in Meade, remove that water during times of drought and shortage. That flexibility is incredibly valuable to California and to Metropolitan, and that is one of the things that we look at as a valuable tool. That requires the cooperation of all the states, and that's something that DCP provides. And then Kevin can handle the easy part.
So the value to IID would be in an affirmative program of water storage. So we're not interested in transferring water. We're not interested in generating system water. We're interested within California generating storage. That is water that we can bank and under circumstances in which we need it, call it back. So that is something that IID has been denied ever since the original legislation that built Hoover Dam. So it may be now that circumstances are such that people need IID. California needs IID. As for the impacts on the Salton Sea, there certainly will be impacts. We think that they're within a band where they're manageable. But we've talked to Metropolitan about that, and we've spoken to our QSA partner, San Diego County Water Authority, about it. People are of different minds about how manageable those impacts might be on the Salton Sea. But if the Salton Sea is truly, smaller but sustainable, then it ought not stand in the way of IID's participation in a DCP that benefits the entire Colorado River.
Okay, next question, please.
I'd like to follow up on Eric's first question about the need for legislation. I infer from the question that there is an agreement that legislation is needed, but I'm not sure that that's a correct inference. So I'd like to ask the panel members, is everyone in agreement that legislation is in fact needed? For those who think it's needed for a DCP, what are the sort of specific problems that for which DCP requires federal action? And for those who might not think legislation is needed, sort of what's the argument against legislation? Because you all made it sound really hard.
So the legislation from Arizona's perspective is needed because of the decree in Arizona v. California, which I think everyone knows Arizona holds that really sacred, that decree. And in the 2007 guidelines, to deliver intentionally created surplus, the system has to be in normal or surplus conditions. There's no path forward in that agreement to deliver water in a shortage. And you heard Jeff say earlier that a key part of the DCP for California is to be able to store water, and when Met has real problems, like they've had recently, they'll be able to take that water out below 1075, the shortage trigger in the guidelines. We believe to make that happen and to not, and to deal with parts of the decree that address the ability for the Secretary to deliver water in volumes more than 4.4 million acre feet to California in a shortage, we need that federal blessing that Jeff described, and so that the Secretary, through that blessing, can operate pursuant to the terms of the DCP. And there might be some other things in there, but that's the big one for Arizona.
Okay. I am a little more in the camp of legislation is desirable, not necessary, but it would be very valuable to have. I look at the flexibility this agreement provides and what we've been able to do. Just a little more than a decade ago, 15 years ago, the way Metropolitan operated its system is we took every drop of Colorado River water available to us and only the amount of state water project that we needed to then fulfill our needs, and left the rest on the table in California. And the reason for that was we had zero ability to bank, store, transfer, and move around our Colorado River water. 2007, when we put together the guidelines, we now have flexibility. That goes to the benefit of the whole river. Metropolitan has been willing to leave water in the system and help the overall system, but that's because we don't lose our rights necessarily to that water. So I look at this year, Metropolitan coming off 4 years of drought where we took every drop of Colorado River water available to us. This year we are going to actually take the least amount of Colorado River water deliveries in more than 50 years. We're actually only going to move about 400,000 acre feet of Colorado River water into Southern California. The remaining 700,000 acre feet, we're going to be banking in Lake Mead, the biggest put of ICS storage that we ever have, and the rest in the Coachella Valley. That kind of flexibility is remarkable. There are some legal questions as to some of these mechanisms, and that's why legislation is like belts and suspenders, and it makes sure that we have access to all those tools that we can use to make the whole system better. And so in that sense, legislation becomes very desirable.
All right, questions, please? Mark? I have a couple if you don't. Let's see if is this, no, that's not a question. That's taking an early
running
break.
from the room.
Yeah, okay, my question is from the yeah, all right, Jennifer Gimbel.
Just to save you for a little bit. And John, this is not the question you're expecting. You heard Don talk about Upper Basin drought planning, and he talked about getting water to Lake Powell. And I think in the Upper Basin, we kind of think of that as like a water bank. But there are some lower basin, upper basin issues that need to be resolved before that really works. And so I wondered if you all in the lower basin had time to think about an upper basin water bank and how that could work for you. So.
That's exactly the question I was expecting, Jennifer. In concept, more water in Lake Powell is a good thing for everyone. More water in Lake Mead accrues to the benefit of the upper basin. More water in Lake Powell will ultimately accrue to the benefit of the lower basin. So I don't foresee anyone in the lower basin having a disagreement in concept of having more water in Powell if that's what the upper basin wants to try to achieve. In application, I think the challenges are primarily how can the upper basin demonstrate that actions taken in demand management actually result in more water in Lake Powell. The measurement, the data acquisition tools available to the upper basin are not as refined as what's available in the lower basin. So simply demonstrating the torque test, the but for the actions in the upper basin, would that water have been in Lake Powell or not? I think that's a threshold issue for the lower basin. And then secondarily, once the water's in Lake Powell, how is it accounted for? What are the rules of the road? Does it apply towards the 75 million over 10 years? Does it apply towards 823? Does it get released in accordance with the 07 guidelines or ultimately the successor guidelines in 2026? These things, I believe, can be resolved, but I think it's a pretty long road to answering that multifaceted question to ultimately achieve the ability for the upper basin to bank water in Lake Powell.
And I think John pretty much said it. I think what we have to do is, I've been very pleased with the system conservation program and how we've all contributed money and funding, at least all the urban areas, and then put water into the system. We've shown we can induce and entice people to leave water in the system and make it grow. And we've shown the ability to grow the pot. And that has been a very successful system conservation pilot program that we've done the last few years. I think the next step is, how do we figure out the accounting? How do we measure it? How do we turn this into a tool that people will fund is not just for the system, but then becomes an ability to create those transfers and storage programs that would work upper basin to lower basin. You have an incredibly diverse panel up here of a bunch of old white guys, but we managed to really solve these issues, and we got to sit down and negotiate and work out these last bit of differences, and we probably can, even despite our diversity.
Don, did you want to add anything to that?
I might just clarify that the upper basin has not officially proposed a bank. We are gaining experience on how demand management might work in the upper basin. And one of the things we're beginning to see is that to generate the amount of volume of water that would be needed to make a difference, we would need to do it over several years. We can't generate that in one single season. And so the several year concept of being able to generate water is what leads us to conclude that if we have demand management, we probably need some mechanism like a bank. And it has to have some different rules than what is currently covered in the interim guidelines in order to make it function.
Okay, let me add a similar question to the panelists to that, and that is, we have drought contingency plans, very complicated, very important. We have the next generation, if you want to call it, of the interim guidelines or the guidelines. Whether they're interim is one of those things that we're going to have to deal with. But my question for the panelists is, it's really seems like it's a gray area as to what has to be in the drought contingency plans versus what will actually end up being in the next generation of the interim guidelines. And how do we manage to, how do we get the right balance so that those things that take a little bit more thought, a little bit more technical support, end up in the interim guidelines and don't hold up drought contingency plans, which we might need before the 2026, before 2026 and the current guidelines expire. So a question I would add that to Jeff and Tom and John and Don.
So I guess, Eric, one of the things from my perspective that the DCP implementation could do is we could get some learning out of how some of those things work, and then perhaps it makes it more simple, gain more support to make those things that we know work be part of the next set of the guidelines. So we love to do pilots. We love to be really careful and conservative. But when we show that the pilots really work, I think then we've shown that we've taken the next step in making those things that have been tested in the pilot more permanent. And I think that that's part of the value of the DCP and part of why the sooner we get it in place, the better. It will give us more time to test some of the actions that are outlined in the DCP.
We tend to work better when we do things incrementally, and so I think any progress is valuable, and I like how we usually call things interim that last 25, 35 years, and our pilots tend to be 5 to 10 years long, but that's how you make incremental progress, and that's how we continue to work on this, and so it makes perfect sense to me to come up with some interim guidelines that will get us through, say, 2050 or so.
My view is that the crux of DCP and the genesis of it was in April of, 2015, we had a virtual certainty we were heading into shortage. We had experienced horrific hydrologic conditions on the river, and then we got our Miracle May, and that turned it around and gave us the buffer to negotiate some proactive measures. And under the leadership of Esteban Lopez at the time, we came together and negotiated DCP, and it's pretty simple, right? We're gonna agree in advance how much water we're gonna leave in the lake, and in return for that, we're gonna get some flexibility on how we can access that water when we really need it. That's what DCP is. That's all it is. All this other stuff needs to be in the 2020 to 2026 negotiations. And the more we try to pile on and solve the future problems at the expense of a relatively simple proactive measure to protect our interest in the immediate foreseeable future, the more likely we are to fail to protect those immediate interests.
Don, did you have?
Well, John, I can't disagree with what you said about the need to keep it simple and the potential for failure, as well as what Tom said. I think the view from the Upper Basin, and I'm speaking for myself, is that the Lower Basin DCP has started the negotiation on the interim guidelines. There are changes proposed in the interim guidelines as part of that DCP to make it work. And they're probably needed in order to be able to be successful in having a DCP. But nonetheless, those negotiations have occurred. The Upper Basin has a number of tweaks that we are looking at relative to the interim guidelines that we have not put on the table. And there may be some issues that if legislation goes forward that the Upper Basin needs to see in the form of tweaks to the guidelines that precedes the formal negotiation of the interim guidelines to extend them or modify them. So I think that's my message, is that we view the discussion has already begun, that the Upper Basin has not really begun to negotiate or represent changes that we may need. I think we're sensitive to the fact that we need to keep this simple, that it needs to be straightforward to have an opportunity to be passed in the form of legislation. The other thing that I would say is when the guidelines are formally negotiated, again after DCPs are done, that the issue of the supply and demand imbalance in the Lower Basin especially is going to loom large and will be a significant factor in how we look at the guidelines and what's designed to get us forward for the next 20 or 30 years.
All right, well, thank you. Another question. Like I say, I have one more if the audience doesn't. Oh, it's right here.
Yeah, I'm Mary Lee Mathias from Irvine Ranch Water District in California. I have grave concerns if you allow this issue to go to Congress. I mean, mostly because when you reflect on how long it has taken to get consensus, you have the expertise there to do it. And I don't know, I'm familiar with our relationship with our representatives in California, all who are very much involved in water and who have been very favorable to push things forward, even in with the Western states. But if you who know the issues so well, and if you have negotiated in the past, if you can't do it, I have grave concern that you can persuade a number of legislators to the issues themselves and their ability to understand. Because each of you said, you speak for your own interests first. And that's generally what we are required to do. But I'm just urging the experts up there to continue their work and recognize if you cannot do it, I don't know how Congress can do it.
I'll say something to that. I've really deferred to the lawyers and the policy wonks involved in this as far as the need to go to Congress. I do have some trepidation about approaching Congress with this, since Congress has not shown itself of late to be a precise, predictable body. But I do see our mutual friend Bob Snow in the back of the room, and I'm reminded that he has suggested that we ought to look at DCP as an overlay in relation to the interim guidelines. And I think that's helpful. But in case I don't get the opportunity before this is over, my impression is that the Upper Basin, Don, has been somewhat halting and guarded about what we're doing or what we're proposing in the Lower Basin. It's my sense that a lot of the motive force behind DCP has been Arizona. And I think Arizona's, it's going to be incumbent on Tom to somehow manage the internecine disputes that have broken out there. And within California, I think Metropolitan, IID, need to close this elusive 5% so we can, get the whole 100 and make a deal within California. And I think we can do it. I think it's in everybody's interest that we do it, and that the feds, if they're not prepared to lead, that they, at least help us usher it in to a place where we can finish this.
All right. Anything else for any other? We have a minute or two left, and then I understand we have a drawing, another panel, and after a break, and then another panel. That panel is going to be moderated by Taylor Hawes, and it's going to deal with system conservation, a subject that we talked about here. So it's a great transition into a very complicated issue as well. So if not, I think what we'll have next is correct? It's the drawing. And thank this panel, especially thank them for their candid answers to questions.
It wasn't there. It was not there.